Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good evening and welcome, and thank you for coming tonight to the MIT Enterprise Forum program on science fiction, the catalyst for change. My name is Jimmy Gia, and I am the chair of the MIT Enterprise Forum Northwest chapter, and we're really excited to have you here. The MIT Enterprise Forum is a global organization of dedicated professionals with 25 local chapters across the world, affiliated with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology through the MIT Tech Review. We inform, connect, and coach technology entrepreneurs to enable them to make rapid transformations of their ideas into world-changing companies. This local chapter is a volunteer-run organization, and over 70 people per year come to help us be inspired and educated about things like tonight's technology leaderships programs. And just like all of our other programs, this would not have been possible without our cadre of volunteers, including Jan Gray-Lorne, who's the team lead, Rebecca Connor, Brenda Cooper, Glenn Heemstra, Shirley Lundy, Vicki Owens, Adam Schuster, Jawin Shi, and Alan Steedman. So thank you very much for your efforts putting this together. And our programmatic season is also made possible by our sponsors, from Lawrence and Haug, T-Mobile, Microsoft, B Technical Graphics, Freelot Computing, the MIT Club of Puget Sound Video, and Seattle Met Magazine. And for the program tonight, what we're going to hear are some stories of people who have been inspired by science fiction when they were very young, and to see how they have taken that and transformed their careers and created the technologies of our lives. So hopefully we can walk away tonight to be inspired to do some of that ourselves as well. And so to begin with, let's welcome our panel of authors, Greg Bear and Nancy Kress. Both of them have long lists of successes, long lists of awards from Nebulas and Hugos for the best science fiction. But I would have to say few authors have been able to win both awards for the same work. And so I decided to give a little bit of a comparison of how rare that is. And so I kind of dug deep into some of my background, which is in chemistry. And I went back to my friend, the periodic table of elements. And what I found, and as you know, that the higher the atomic number, the more rare the element, the shorter the half-life, and the harder it is to create. And what I found was that in all of history, in all of human history, we've created 75 atoms of cupernicium, which is element 112, and 80 atoms of fluorium, which is element 114. On the other hand, only 16 authors, including Nancy Kress, has won both the Hugo Nebula for Best Novella, Beggars in Spain, and 14 authors, including Greg Bear, has won the Hugo and Nebula for Best Noveletta for Blood Music. So in conclusion, we can say that a program with both Nancy and Greg is rarer than the meetings of the elements Einsteinium and Rutherfordium as they walk into a bar. Now, moderating the panel today and guiding our conversation is Jason Pontin, the editor-in-chief and publisher of the MIT Technology Review. In his role, Jason is responsible for the editorial direction, media platform, business strategy of the widely respected media company. He's also the chairman of the MIT Enterprise Forum, the global technology entrepreneurial arm of the company, and he himself was born in London, raised in Northern California, although the accent doesn't say that. He was educated in England at the Harrow School and the University of Oxford. So, Jason, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. Science fiction is the secret religion of all technologists, which everyone who became a technologist became so because they grew up reading science fiction, which is why every year MIT Technology Review publishes a wildly unprofitable but very dear to my heart special science fiction issue, in which we have published both the authors sitting to my right. It's also an experiment in trying to recover the roots of the golden age of science fiction. The science fiction we publish in 12 Tomorrows, our special SF edition, seeks to speculate on technologies being developed now and ask what would happen to society if they were broadly used. So what I like about both our authors tonight is that though they've done some very far out stuff, what they write about is usually deeply based upon the most current science and technology thinking. So this is going to be a treat. I'm going to begin, first of all, with Greg. I'm going to ask a few questions also to Nancy, and I'm going to leave 15 minutes at the end to take questions from the audience. So Greg, Doris Lessing, the great British mainstream writer who won the Nobel in 2007, also wrote science fiction, or at least a kind of slipstream.
Absolutely.
And when she was asked about science fiction, she said this. She said, what people don't realize is that science fiction is some of the best social fiction of our time. I admire the classic sort of science fiction, like Blood Music by Greg Bear. He's a great writer. Can't get better than that from
I
Doris
love
Lessing.
Doris, and when she got the Nobel, I says, "Go, Doris!"
So Greg's first sale was in 1973, but for many of us,
1966, actually.
that was a fanzine piece, though.
No, it was.
No, really?
I got $10 for a story.
Okay.
I was in 11th grade. That was pretty impressive.
Whenever it was, most of us first encountered Greg through Blood Music, which was published in '85 and expanded from a short story published in Analog in 1983. I want to see a show of hands who's read Blood Music. Okay,
Very
so
nice. What about the rest of you?
So for those of you who don't know, it was the first science fiction novel that really tackled nanotechnology in a notable way. A socially maladroit Southern Californian researcher was banned by his employer from continuing experiments, so he does what we all do. He injected himself with the nanobots. The critters proliferate, everything goes very badly, and that's just the beginning of the novel. By the end, reality itself is being reprogrammed. So I would like you to talk a little bit about the genesis and the development and the concepts of Blood Music.
Well, Blood Music got started when I read a piece in New Scientist way back in the good old days, like 81 or 82, talking about biochips. And these were programmable silicon chips attached to proteins that you could inject into the bloodstream, and they'd run around and collect data on you. And then you could collect them later and from a blood sample, apparently, and deprogram them and figure out what was going on. And I suddenly had this moment of realization, wait a minute, DNA is a computational system. I was wrong, but it was where it began. And I says, if you could do this, you could actually reprogram DNA and have read-write DNA, use it as a memory store and as, inspiration and everything else. And that's where it began. So I sent the story off to Analog. Actually, I sent it to a couple of places first. Sent it to Omni, and my good friend Ellen Datlow says, this is just too weird and it's too talky. So she rejected it. And I've chided her about it ever since. But then I sent it off eventually to Analog. Playboy didn't like it either. Too much like sex, I guess. Anyway, the folks at Analog, it was Stan Schmidt at that point, and Stan says, okay, you've got all of these pieces of DNA, and you got all this memory. Prove to me that you have enough memory and DNA to make this work. So I sat down and calculated it and used an extremely optimistic figure, and he says, okay, we'll publish that. And doing that little extra work sent me down the track to what would eventually become Darwin's Radio and everything else, which is, my God, there was a lot going on in the 80s, and hardly anybody was paying attention to it. A lot of biological companies were working on these things for business models, but the scientists weren't paying attention. Certainly in evolutionary biology, they were not paying any attention at all. So I could go down to UCSD and visit the genetics lab there and talk to people and everything, but the companies wouldn't let me in. They didn't want a science fiction writer talking to their scientists. I said, okay, this is going to get interesting. And that, like the story, that as a clue in a mystery, that's pretty important. So that's what I was doing back in the early 80s.
That's great. Nancy, you got going a little later than Greg, though, having got the date wrong before. I'm not going to guess. When was your first short story sale?
1976.
I would have got that one right. So after that, Nancy's first 3 novels were fantasy, but then she really moved over to SF, mostly in the mid-'80s. Won a Nebula in '86 for out of all of them bright stars. And I'm going to list her nebulas. Jimmy kind of referred to them, but it's pretty amazing. Best novella, 1991, Beggars in Spain. Best novelette, 1998, The Flowers of Owlet Prison. Best novella, 2007, Fountains of Age. Best novella, 2012, After the Fall, Before the Fall, and During the Fall. Best novella, 1992, Beggars in Spain. Best novella, 2009, The Erdemann Nexus. So I guess the move to SF worked out pretty well. When you cast your mind back, tell us a little bit about the development, how you decided you were an SF writer, and how you decided what kind of SF writer you wanted to be.
Well, as you said, I started out with fantasy, and my science fiction has gotten harder and harder. I don't mean more difficult, although that too, but it has become more focused on actual science with every 5-year interval. And as to why this has happened, I don't really know. My career has not been planned. I'm really in awe of those people who say, well, I have a 25-year plan for writing. I'm going to do this kind of a book and establish a brand, and then this kind of a book and build on it. I can't do that. I never could do that. But ever since I was young, I've been a science groupie. I'm not trained as a scientist. I just marry them. And I really got involved with the idea of science as it translates to technology, as it then affects real people. Because real people are not really affected by pure science. I don't mean to slight anybody in this room. Of course, you're real people. But the ordinary man in the street really does not have his life affected by the cosmological constant or string theory. He has it affected when science becomes technology and technology becomes something that impacts his life. And that's the point where I get really interested. What happens to ordinary, normal people when technology, new technology comes in and upends everything that goes on? My arguably most successful work, Beggars in Spain, is about people genetically engineered to never need to sleep. And I wrote this out of sheer jealousy. I need 9 hours. I get cranky if I don't get it. And I really envy those people that need very few hours of sleep. But I wrote it in 1992. And since then, and I didn't have a very firm scientific basis for what I did with the genetic engineering. As time has gone on, it's gotten firmer and firmer and firmer. One of the moments I'm the most proud of is I wrote a book called Oaths and Miracles, which has to do with biological research at Whitehead Biological Research Institute in Boston. And it has to do with a scientist who was murdered while he's investigating envelope proteins. And I got a call one day from somebody who said, "You don't know me, Miss Kress, but I'm a researcher at Biological in Whitehead in Boston. And we have a researcher who's a womanizer, just like your guy, and he's working on envelope proteins. And who do you know up here?" So we had a 20-minute conversation on envelope proteins. It took him 30 seconds to discover I don't actually know very much about envelope proteins. But this is what science fiction writers do if you're not scientifically trained. You take small amounts of interesting, not to say fascinating, science, and you try to both extrapolate into how they would affect normal people and also try to make it look like you know a lot more than you actually do.
Nancy, in Beggars in Spain, it's not just that your protagonist, Leisha Camden, doesn't need to sleep. That gene therapy is a benefit of a 1%, right? The gene-modded are the beneficiaries of a alteration that is not available to a large portion of the population. On the most current issue of Technology Review is a story about a brand new technology called CRISPR-Cas9 that uses, who knows about CRISPR? So CRISPR is terrifying in some level because though it has enormous potential, right, for prevention, it's going to be very tempting to use some of these technologies for alteration. And at least initially, those alterations are going to be available to the very rich.
Yes, I read that article. Yeah. And the last line of that article in the current issue of the Technology Review is a quote from a researcher who says, "The public has no idea what's coming, but it is coming." And when I speak to young people, I tell them there are going to be decisions on genetic engineering partly on bacteria, partly on animals, partly on crops, and partly on germline, that you are going to have to make decisions about. Because once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. And there will have to be decisions made along these lines.
Do you worry initially, Nancy, that when all technologies come down in price, but initially these are going to be fairly pricey?
Well, that's what my book is about. Because when I wrote this, I wanted to create a genetic engineering on human beings that has no downside. Usually, when science fiction does genetic engineering on human beings, they create clones that are monsters, or they have weird telepathic properties, or there's some kind of strange side effect where they all drop dead at age 20 of cancer, or some weird kind of thing. I wanted to create a genetic engineering on human beings with no downside. The problem is then you don't have a story. Because as I tell my writing students, fiction is about stuff that gets screwed up. Nobody wants to read a 400-page novel where everything goes well. You might want your life to be like that, but that's not fiction. So in order to have a conflict and a story with a genetic engineering on human beings where nothing goes wrong, I had to look at the sociological implications. What happens if you start creating that 1% who has an evolutionary advantage, and not needing to sleep would be a tremendous evolutionary advantage. You get an extra 8 hours of life every single day. So what it has to do, my story, the conflict comes from the sleepless and those that have to actually sleep. And it only gets, because it's inheritable, it's a dominant gene, it only gets more pronounced with each generation. And we'll have to face this. There's only 3 ways that the control of genetic engineering can go. It can be controlled by the market, in which case the rich people will eventually get it. It can try to be controlled by the government, and we can see what a great record Congress has at controlling pretty much of anything at the moment. Or it can be controlled by scientists themselves, as with the recent policy manifesto that just came out of China, where a great many Chinese researchers have agreed to not carry out any more CRISPR and other experiments on germline embryos, partly because the success rate at deleting genes is only 40%, and at inserting them is only 20%. And to do that on mice is one thing, to do it on human beings is something else entirely. But you can have the scientists try to control it, you can have the government try to control it, or you let the market try to control it. And all of those things have got downsides, and that's what I was interested in exploring.
Greg, in Queen of Angels in 1990 and Slant in 1997, you also addressed social stratification from therapies. I think in those novels, the therapy to have access to better jobs, to political office.
Right. Well, we see that now. We see failure to launch in large portions of our populations. Well, 3 to 7%, sometimes more, is just a significant problem. These people cannot fit into society. They go ballistic, and you give them guns, you've got a major issue. Well, that happens far too often and has for centuries. What would happen if you could take a person who has the potential to not completely launch and give them the potential to launch? It'd be like staying awake longer, right? They're not dumb most of the time. Or they don't have fatal mental errors that just crop up every time they turn around. Well, society is going to start demanding more and more. If you want to get a job, don't go crazy on us, right? And we don't want anybody who isn't guaranteed to be sane. So I don't know what that long term would be, but in Queen of Angels, it results in a lot of different approaches and a lot of pressures, and kind of the same thing you get in Beggars in Spain. The whole background of the story, of course, is crime. And so my major character is a police detective who's decided to engineer her body so it works fine to be a police detective or a police person. But she's also changed an oriental physiology to very shiny black skin, orca shiny is how I describe it, to feet that are like boots, to all sorts of things going. She's highly adapted to her job. How is she ever going to be able to go back? She doesn't care. She likes what she does. But in solving crimes, what happens when you don't have that many crimes anymore? You know, when people are adapted well enough not to, and this becomes kind of the Brave New World approach to writing about the future. I find a lot of conflicts in there, and of course a lot of rich people who really don't want to be controlled in any way. And so they may allow themselves to be natural, And to be crazy, because that's good for them. We all know that CEOs are psychopathic. So once we understand that fact, then and actually there's a certain amount of truth to this. If you take we've met a lot of CEOs over the years, and those who start major companies have to have certain areas of focus which normal people would stay away from.
Unlike writers?
Well, we know a lot of writers we could talk about, but they don't actually control whole segments of the economy unless they're Stephen King or J.K. Rowling. But yeah, so this comes back and forth into what is society, what is adaptability, what is creativity, what is the society aiming for when it creates individuals of these sorts? And that's a really interesting question because they are useful. But we don't think of it that way. As the metaphor I used way back in the 70s was that if you're in a fishing boat, you would get up a bunch of minnows and you'd throw one carp into the tank of minnows as you're going back to the dock. And that carp would chase the minnows all around the tank for hours and days until you got back to the dock and only eat a few. And the minnows would hate it, but it would keep them fit and keep them alert. They wouldn't just fall asleep and die floating at the bottom of the tank. Is that what we're talking about with criminal behavior? If it is, and we get rid of it, what's going to happen to the rest of society?
Greg, do you think these technologies have such utility, both for individuals and for society as a whole, that the democratization of them will become an absolute imperative?
Probably. Yeah. But the one thing I will not bet against is wherever you can make your kids better or smarter or healthier, any of those technologies will be put in place for good or ill at some point. And so that's all you have to offer.
In a way, they already are, without anybody noticing. I can remember in 1978 when the first test tube baby, Louise Brown, was created. And there was yelling and screaming in the press, we're creating monsters, we're playing God, we have no right to do this. Now there are tens of thousands of IVF babies. You could be one if you were born after 1978. Go ask your mother. And they're no different from anybody else. The next step, which also crept in very easily, was you fertilize in a petri dish and you create maybe 6 embryos. So once we could scan for certain genetic diseases like Huntington's chorea, you scan them. And if you are carrying these, you pick embryos without them. Nobody really objects much to that. The one after that, which is getting there, is if we can identify genes that contribute to other kinds of personality or physical attributes, and you start scanning for those. Okay. Then you haven't crossed the line because you haven't actually messed around with the germline yet. But that is already going on, I'm told reliable by people in vitro fertilization. Even though we're not sure which genes they are, we have some idea where some of them, for instance, increased dopamine receptors that tend to produce greater risk takers. And they're starting to look at those things when they pick out which of the embryos, if they have a choice, they want. So it's happening, but it's happening very quietly and stealthily.
Yes.
But it's been out there in science fiction for years. I mean, we got to go back to the 1920s. Yes. Brave New World talks about all of this.
He calls it
Bokanization. But you heat up the embryos, and they change, and then you get what you want, and you decant them and raise them and put them. Why do you hate it?
Yeah, so what's wrong with
Why do I hate it? Because it does 2 things that I really object to. One is it presumes that all of the planet, or most of it, or even all of the country, will have the same culture and the same control, and everybody will be subjected to this. This is why I hated Gattaca, too. Yeah. You're never going to get it applied to everybody. The other reason is that naturally it shows only the negative outcomes of what genetic engineering can be. And I have done this too. I've written stories with mostly just negative outcomes of science and technology, and it makes me feel a little bit guilty because I'm the biggest science groupie you ever saw. And I have a big gung-ho positive attitude towards most science. And yet a lot of the stories I write portray negative outcomes because it makes a better story. It's an ethics issue that concerns me. Do you think about that?
My stories are about societies that are what we have now, which is a mixed bag. And I don't think we'll ever escape from that. You know, I don't like utopias too much. Dystopias have to be really interesting, and I'm not sure that Brave New World is a dystopia at all. Most of the people are very happy. There's a lot of sex going on. and then you look at it and you say, well, it's like a rock music vision of heaven. Except, why do we object? And Huxley is saying, I don't know, I'm not sure I object. And of course, he died on LSD in '63. So we don't know that it was a bad place.
Well, the theme of the
It's just
book, right, is that the hero who can't fit in is a deeply maladjusted and not particularly attractive individual.
Which is Huxley. I mean, every writer knows this feeling. You just write yourself into the story, and you're then the carp in the middle of the minnows. But we go beyond that, and we have all the 30s and 40s. We have the tissue culture king, Julian Huxley, another Huxley. They probably got it from Thomas, but he was Darwin's bulldog, which sounds like genetic manipulation to me. And then you add all these things into the 30s, and you've got all of these amazing stories being told in the pulp magazines, not just The Machine Stops or that sort of story, but the stories of people who have allowed themselves to be intellectually enhanced so they can't walk anymore.
Well, the question you're raising is, if we got to be happier and better, what would be the effect on society as a whole? If Winston Churchill hadn't been a depressive with the black dog hanging on him all of the time, would he have been as effective as
Would
a
Mark
leader?
Twain have been as funny?
Would Mark Twain have been as funny? A lot of writers are depressives, which comes as no news to anybody. So not only do you want to keep the criminals in order to keep us all on our toes,
Crazy
we need
people.
to keep the crazy people to keep us.
Well,
Anybody
you
else?
guys, many of you work
Anybody
at
else
Microsoft. You know what I'm talking about.
Anybody else you think we need to keep? The crazy people, the criminals?
There's an interesting thing here. When you talk about what society is and what it does and what you learn to love, is you learn to love your defects. If we look at medieval culture, it's nothing but defects. And then we look at, say, A Brave New World or a Hollywood movie, and there's no defects. There's hardly a mole in the entire cast. And you ask yourself, okay, how do actors like Charles Laughton get along in this group of totally beautiful people, gay and ugly and extraordinarily bright and talented? Well, of course, he became a director, but that's another issue. The whole point is that the mix of society is not under our control for good reason. What becomes a problem is when you have these tidal surges of impassioned social causes or political causes or whatever that are like wildfires. They just wipe us out. Europe has done that so many times. We can and China, of course, too. The Asian nations have gone through this so many times. I was reading about the Spanish and the Philippines in the 16th century, But there's a guy named Yenta who is bombarding the walls of China in 1580. And he's a Mongol. Or at least he's one of the steppes tribes, okay? This has been going on for 1,000 years there. And, what's China going to be like without that? And that expands into the historical perspective of how many challenges do you need? We all would like to live peaceful lives, except we don't want to be bored.
My first science fiction novel, which the New York Times called very too long because Kress feels the need to say everything twice, and I'm afraid they were right, nonetheless dealt with that problem. What evolutionary advantage is violence to us? And the advantage, one advantage at least, that I posited in the novel, is that it breaks up existing groups. And when it breaks up existing groups, they become competitive, and when you become competitive, new things emerge out of there that won't happen otherwise. Countries get broken up, tribes get broken up, civilizations get broken up, and out of that is the possibility of new things coming. But it's a high price to pay.
I wonder if the same thing is mental illness. That if you have mental illness or depression or the broad category of things we refer to as mental illness, whether that gives you a unique perspective that then allows you to put back into society what no one else could do. If we take a look at Alan Turing, the incredibly sad story of his life, which was also a brilliant story, and or many other great people. Certainly in the sciences we can do this, but you say in politics, yes, absolutely in politics, and not just Churchill. Especially English politics is the most disorganized group of depressives we've ever seen.
It's the weather.
Yeah,
it's the weather.
It's the weather, and we have the same weather here, so that may explain a lot. But how much does this contribute? How much does your unhappiness contribute to your greatness? That's a question I'm not sure I want to have answered, except in the positive with affirmations of buckets of cash. If you're going to be crazy, then at least you should have a good sports car, right?
We have focused on the effects of technology on terrestrial civilizations, but science fiction has often used extraterrestrial civilizations as a mechanism to disrupt life on Earth or to do other metaphorical things. Greg wrote 2 joint books, The Forge of God and The Anvil of the Stars, where he talked about one potential paradox to the Fermi paradox. So I think it's fair to say that you're in agreement with Stephen Hawking that we really shouldn't be transmitting signals to tell everyone in the universe we're here when we don't know who's out there.
I was talking about this long before Mr. Hawking brought it back up. But he probably read science fiction as a kid, so
That's where he
God
got it
knows
from.
what he was reading at the time. All you have to do is read War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
You know, that's a long time ago. And you say, okay, I'm not sure we want the Martians to know we're here.
So in the first of the novel, The Forge of God, he has a scene where Earth gets destroyed, literally blown
Spoiler
apart
alert.
in a protracted 30-page section. It's great, you should read it. And in the second book, The Forge of God, the remaining Earthlings head off to their destroyers.
Anvil Stars.
Anvil Stars, forgive me. Anvil Stars, and they kill them. So,
But along the way, what they have to discover, they're kids. They're basically the kid survivors of Earth, and their credo is, you know, if you mess with Earth, you have to face us.
Yeah.
So it's like a bicycle gang given the power by an alien technology to go traveling across the stars, not at faster than light speed. They don't give them that yet, but then to exact vengeance. So if Forge of God is a murder mystery, then you've got the vengeance side of it, the law and order side of it comes down in Anvil of Stars. And along the way, they discover, okay, we have to do some things that aren't good here. Because, of course, being bad guys, the aliens have totally set themselves up to be, you know, challenging our heroes greatly. So all of that is classic science fiction. There's nothing particularly unusual in all of that. The whole concept of the universe as an ecosystem, however, is fairly new. And the notion that you have tides of biology spreading around the galaxy probably begins with either Wells or with Olaf Stapledon. And panspermia was nothing for these guys. But remember, panspermia came out, when was it, 1900s? Swedish Svante Arrhenius or whoever it was. And so that ideas have been around for a very long time. And now we're finding out, yeah, okay, maybe life didn't begin on Earth. Maybe it didn't begin on Mars. Maybe it began in the ice moons. And if it began in the ice moons, maybe it didn't begin there. Maybe it began in the Oort cloud. And where are we going to go to find all of these, you know, these beginnings for life? And as we expand our way outward, we're getting farther out into the universe, and it's going to be really interesting to see where it all ends. We might all be a band of brothers out there, brothers and sisters, and of course the neutrals. And it's going to be fascinating to find this all out. But what we're seeing now, news stories get leaked on these new websites whose journals I've never heard of before. And they usually borrow from Nature or Science or from some other scientific journal, and they get really sensationalistic headlines, which I kind of love. But they're echoing the science stories. And they're finding out there's life on Europa. There could be life on Europa. Maybe it's reaching up to touch us, you know. And who was it was saying, you know, I'm waiting, it was Neil deGrasse Tyson saying, I'm waiting for something on Europa to reach up and lick the camera lens, which just happened in the Rand Paul campaign. So I'm not sure whether they discovered life in Rand Paul's camp or not, but certainly something from Europa was there. This is in 2010. This is Arthur C. Clarke's thing. He was there at the very beginning. He grabs this and runs with it. What we do is we listen to the scientists, and then we say, you don't realize how cool an idea that is, and I can do something with that. And I love the fact that Arthur was there first because, A, he got a good book out of it, sold it for a fair hunk of change, and then he got a good movie out of it. And we see the life on Europa in the movie, but people keep saying it as if it's new. If they make a science fiction movie out of it, it's not new. It's been around as an idea for a while.
Nancy, if we met an extraterrestrial race, as we will one day, what do you think it'll be like?
I think it depends on what the planet is like.
Yeah.
If the planet is fairly Earth-like, and if panspermia or some version of panspermia is in fact a fact, it may look a lot more like us than we think we do.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if the planet is something very strange, or if it's an organization of intelligence that is more electronic, for instance, that has to do with magnetic waves, that has to do with things between the stars that we don't yet understand, then it could be totally and completely alien to the point where we in no way ever understand it.
Could we communicate with such a being?
I don't know. Science fiction is not really about saying this is what will happen. It's about saying this is what could happen.
Well, that's why could is a good question.
Since I'm more interested in what could happen in the next 100 years, I tend to focus a lot of my fiction here and now in short-term projection rather than way out there.
So let me just talk about short-term projection. This is a question for both of you. Technologists make a habit of predicting the future, and they often get things badly wrong as they do their speculation. One particularly famous instance happened on this campus in 1993 when Bill pronounced that 640K ought to be enough for everyone. So do you guys feel that science fiction faces similar scenarios? What I'm asking is, does science fiction go through idea plateaus, where there are kind of invention droughts, and we cease to be particularly productive of new ideas?
I think we sometimes have lapses in the appreciation of the ideas that are out there. But if you take a look at the 20th century, there were no droughts. Every decade was filled with something new and innovative, different writers coming, or quite often they were scientists writing, not just Julian Huxley. But you had Eric Temple Bell writing as John Taine and writing pretty amazing science fiction stories. H.G. Wells was fairly well-known, well-educated scientifically, and he would talk to scientists frequently. So every decade in the 20th century is packed full of these things, but especially in the 20s and 30s, when you have a couple of writers come in who just knock the game out of the ballpark. Not the ball, the entire game. And one of them was, I'm going to forget his name. He wrote The World, the Flesh, and the Devil. And it was J.D. Bernal. J.D. Bernal wrote this book, he was like 24, 25 years old, and he wrote this book. It's only about 100 pages long. And it's a Bible for science fiction ideas. He's describing giant starships, which we're going to get later on, and people like Doc Smith and so on. He's describing all the things that could happen in technology, computers, invasions, whatever. There it is. He's a 25-year-old bloody science fiction genius who never wrote science fiction. Instead, he went off and pioneered in science and wrote books on science. Olaf Stapledon was a philosophy major and an English professor, I believe, but he came out of Egypt, and so like a lot of Navy brats, and I'm a Navy brat, or military brats, he had a upbringing in an alien culture. Went back to England and started thinking about and writing about these extraordinary histories of the universe and the galaxies and stuff. And one time his wife remembers him as they're sitting on the bluff overlooking the beach, and they hear these seals down on the rocks of the beach. And the seals are starting to be washed with water. They've been drying on the rocks, and they're complaining about being hit by these waves coming in. And Stapleton gets this look on his face, and he says, "They sound human, don't they?" And she says, "They did." And at that point he says, what shapes can human beings take down the road given sufficient time and impetus? And in Last and First Men, he had 18 different species of humans spread out over 2 billion years through the decline and death, the heat death of the solar system, basically. Then we got nuclear fission and fusion come along, and suddenly that ramps up the length of time in the universe. So what Darwin was requesting was, I need more time, please. Please, don't just say the sun's going to burn out in a few 100,000 years, because for evolution to work, I need millions, if not billions of years. And the physicists gave him, I think, after he died, but at any rate, suddenly gave biology a lot of time to mess around. And Stapleton realized that, and he goes, oh my gosh, what we can do with this. In Star Maker, he takes that and expands it out to the universal level. And he has entire galaxies acquire intelligence and evolve and talk to each other. And that's astonishing. But he ends the whole thing in a way that is kind of fraught for science fiction, because he was not a believer in God per se, but he couldn't get away from it. He could not escape it. So he usually made God into the super alien, or the thing he could never quite understand. And in Star Maker, at the end, he takes you to the early versions of our universe made by the adolescent Star Maker, before he had figured out how to do it right. And then, as if to say, okay, this rug hasn't been pulled far enough and fast enough, he gives you visions of the later universes that are more complex and amazing and complete than ours. All in one book, less than 500 pages long. It just knocks my socks off what they were doing in the 1930s.
When science fiction gets it right, I think there's two ways it can get it right, predictively. One is what you're talking about, a mind like Stapleton's that can just go take off into the universe. The other is extrapolating from what's already there. And then people say, oh my God, how did you predict that? But the actual science was already there. A famous story about this, which you may already know, is in 1944, Cleve Cartmill wrote a story called Deadline. And it had to do with the creation of a superweapon based on fissions of atoms. And he had gotten all of the information from the physics journals that were there, but when the story appeared, both the author and the editor, John W. Campbell, received visits from the precursor of the FBI, the OSS, wanting to know how he knew about the Manhattan Project.
It was the FBI,
Yeah. And he did not know about the Manhattan Project, but the information was there, and he was able to take it and extrapolate from it. That's one form of prediction that I think science fiction is pretty good at. However, where we are not particularly good is at social movements. The first science fiction book I ever read was a classic, Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, which is an incredible good place to start if you're going to read science fiction. But if you look at it now, he got very interesting ideas about the science. But when they moved to the island, for instance, George runs off to his new job to investigate what's going to be going on, and Jean stays home to figure out how the oven works, because this is her role. Science fiction missed the women's movement until after the women's movement was already going on in the real world. And this has consistently been true of social movements in science fiction. We miss those. We miss the things that change the underlying way that society functions.
So do you think science fiction is actually worse often at extrapolating social changes from technological events than mainstream fiction?
I think mainstream fiction is no longer interested in technological changes. The science fiction novel is really the inheritor, I know Greg would agree with me on this, of the Victorian novel, which looks at a broad area of society and large questions of society. Dickens was interested in Oliver Twist in the whole question of how does the Industrial Revolution affect people? How does it affect the people at the bottom? What does this do for society as a whole? And the modern mainstream novel doesn't do that very much anymore. A couple people, Jonathan Franzen, but a lot of modern novels are focused on very narrow, small groups of people, a marriage, a village. It's science fiction that is looking at as an inheritor of the Victorian novel, that is looking at society in a broader way. And I think that's one of the things that we need to do and are doing.
Gregory Benford may have blown open this story of, and I haven't confirmed all of this, not even he can confirm it, but the whole notion of Cleve Cartmill and Astounding, 1940s. In the 1930s, 1939, in fact, the New York Times had published news of the fission of the atom, Otto, what's his name? And of course, Lise Meitner, who wasn't given much credit at that point. But then they says, can we get through the next war, or can we get through without actually creating an atomic bomb? Well, in November of 1944, John Campbell wrote the same thing in an editorial in which he says, November 1939, Campbell says, can we get through this coming war without building an atomic bomb? So it was in the air. It was definitely in the air. But he had an instrument that would go to every single scientist and probe them deeply. And he knew this. He didn't have any prejudice about how many people read Astounding. He sold 600 copies of this magazine every month at MIT in the 60s, right? And he knew that there had been this cluster of forwarding addresses in the southwest. And he says, what's going on out there? It's 1943. Things are getting started up. And so Benford actually talked to Edward Teller, about this when they were hanging out in the 60s. Benford was a graduate student working with Teller. And Mr. Teller had an artificial leg and was swimming, and they were swimming together. And Benford says, well, did you guys get your copies of Astounding delivered out to Los Alamos? And Teller says, oh, yes. We all read them. We sat around in the evenings and talked about them, he says. And I'm going, Benford didn't make this wrong conclusion, but I says, oh my God. They're talking about science fiction stories at night at Los Alamos with FBI agents sitting in the corners taking notes. and they say, did you read this story by this guy, Cleve Cartmill, with an atom bomb in it? Do you think that's successful or not? Now, why did Campbell set this up? He's published many stories like this, but it was in the news. He'd already thought about it, and then he says, maybe if I get Cleve, and he often did this, if I give Cleve an idea and he writes it, and I get feedback, I know the answer then. Mm-hmm. And when the FBI knocked on his door and says, can you tell us about this? He goes to himself quite secretly and doesn't talk about it for the rest of the war. He says, it's happening.
Interesting.
He could use his own magazine as a social probe, and that's how I put the story together, but at least we have the facts of the magazines were delivered, scientists read them, scientists talked about them.
Can you confirm something for me that I heard recently? I heard that Wernher von Braun, all through World War II, received copies of Astounding through a dead drop in Switzerland because he wanted to keep reading it.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
That's a great story.
In Germany.
I'm going to take some questions from the audience, but I've got one last question.
Von Braun was a big fan of H.P. Lovecraft, too.
I did know
loved
that.
Getting the books, yeah.
Well, that's strange. So I asked this question of Neil Stevenson in the first edition of 12 Tomorrows, and I asked it to Gene Wolfe last year, and they both gave very different answers. What is science fiction for? What does it do?
I think it does a lot of things. One of them, as we've already said, is exploring what the effect of science translated into technology will be on society as a whole, as represented in individual people that are in the stories. I also think it can take on some of the large themes, like that, what are we here for? Is there a reason for us to be here? Where is the race as a whole going? I think that's what it's for, to be large. When I read, for the first time, Childhood's End, 3 pages in, I was just enraptured. This was a canvas big enough, and I hadn't seen any canvases big enough up till then. So I think that's what science fiction is for, to have a canvas big enough to answer some of the largest questions, as well as some of the very tiny ones, such as what will this piece of technology to do to this particular child in this particular place? It has enormous range.
Mm-hmm. Greg?
I think science fiction is the best toy train set a kid ever had. I think it was Orson Welles talked about a movie studio that way. And I feel that way about science fiction. Because if you write science fiction often enough, you have the excuse to go and talk to scientists who are doing it. And if you're talking to them every so often, you'll spark an idea and they'll go off and do something that you're kind of thinking of. And that's fun too, because you can mess around without having to get a PhD. Although some of my friends like Benford and Bran and so on do have PhDs, and they lord it over us poor English majors.
Don't I know it?
Actually, they don't, which is quite astonishing. In the community of science fiction, I've hung out with, I think Jerry Pournelle has 7 PhDs.
7?
Yeah, and he still occasionally takes advice from us liberal English majors. But I've met so many interesting folks, and I've met so many interesting monsters through science fiction. And you don't know when they're going to become one or the other. And it's like, it's a giant zoo of human nature that's expressed writ large. And up in the Northwest, we get a slightly different slice than I did when I lived in the Southwest. In the Northwest, we get the whole beginning of, at least the continuation of the computer culture. In Los Angeles, I saw the beginning of the science fiction film renaissance in the 1960s and 70s. And get to haul Ray Bradbury around to different special effects studios and use him as a Trojan horse. So all the executives go sit over here, and I can go talk to the special effects guys. You know, and Ray was fabulous. But meeting the science fiction writers in Los Angeles, meeting the, getting together at Caltech. They had a big conference at Caltech. A great panel of David Gerald, Robert Heinlein, Harry Harrison. Who else was there? All kinds of cool folks were there. Jerry Pournelle was there, waxing poetic about black holes and so on.
Can I quote you that science fiction writers are basically a zoo?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's take some...
But let me finish the story. The story is that as we're going through this, Jerry is pontificating about black holes, and suddenly this shorter gentleman, kind of handsome, stands up in the back row, and I look around, and he says, well, we can't be sure about black holes, not necessarily leading to white holes and space travel or time travel. He says, we don't know enough about them yet. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, that's Richard Feynman. And he's contradicting Jerry. And Jerry goes, I bow to the expertise of a Nobel Prize winner, he says. And that's the proper attitude. In that audience was Fred Hoyle, you know, Richard Feynman, Heinlein, who they all came there to see, very likely. And Heinlein was having a ball. What an amazing confluence of culture there. Yeah. And of course, shortly before that, we'd had Arthur C. Clarke and Heinlein and so on being interviewed as the moon landing was taking place. So this is what science fiction is. It's a great toy train.
We have a mic here. Give your questions, say who you are and where you're from, and though short statements are accepted, questions are more polite and interesting. Yeah. Oh, this guy's beating you to it. No.
Tim Mack, formerly president of the World Future Society, so
Cool.
some of you probably know me. I think that science fiction is the place to answer and ask the unanswerable and the unaskable questions. The kind of, well, the biggest thing, I think, are unforeseen and unexpected consequences. Technology, social impact, economic disaster, the kinds of things that people don't want to think about, but can be safely thought about in a fictional setting.
Mm. Yeah. Like jokes.
Well, there's a great connection between science fiction and jokes. Having hung out with a few comedians who are brilliant, I realized, okay, science fiction is difficult. Dying is easy. Comedy is hard. Comedy is the science fiction brain turned on its head. And quite often, there's people like Douglas Adams and so on who really can do both very, very well, but who never quite believed it because you can't have funny science fiction. I mean, he did it, and he was brilliant at it.
Hi, Giles Nelson. I work for Centane, company doing game AI.
Cool.
I have a bit of a statement, but it's really a question, so
Sure.
I'll make it quick. I'm of the position that AIs can only inevitably get out of control.
It's called children.
2 examples. Microsoft, great institution, best minds the world could buy, puts out buggy shit. Microsoft Windows full of bugs and holes, right? That's the best they can do. Make great fortune for everybody. That's one example. The other is if an unlimited AI system is given the ability to reason about anything it wants, it's not bounded, how can it not look at humankind and say, they're the problem?
It's called Colossus the Foreman Project, which didn't realize how buggy it was.
Nancy, do you worry about AIs?
No, I don't, because from what I've been told, we're a long way from having one. And it seems to me there are things we can worry about that are a lot closer. Yeah. But when you said we're the problem, the story of mine that won a Nebula most recently is called After the Fall, Before the Fall, During the Fall. And it deals with the Gaia theory, which is that the Earth is a self-regulating system, not necessarily conscious, that will change anything that is threatening life on it. For instance, the seas should be a lot saltier than they are with all the silt that's washed down from the river, but there are mechanisms in the bottom of the ocean to correct that. The thing that's threatening the Earth most right now and life on it is us. And so steps are taken by feedback mechanisms in order to correct that. Things like that worry me a lot more than AI because they're a lot closer.
Yeah, well, AI is amazingly difficult. We have to understand ourselves, and we're not very good at that. Especially nerds. I'm a nerd, and I have a hard time understanding what I need to do or want to do. and you know, when we talk about artificial intelligences, they must be socially integrated to work. And designing the interface on any system, whether it's software or human individuals, the interface is so utterly crucial, and it's where everything fails. Easy to use is hard to do. Easy to be is hard to do. So when we see people who go blithely through life, never raising a ripple of disdain behind them, that's fascinating. What's going on there? Maybe we should look to that for artificial life.
This is A question mainly for Nancy. My name is Vikram Mulligan. I'm a biochemist at the Institute for Protein Design. I've always been a science fiction fan too. But one thing that you said kind of struck me as surprising. You said that science fiction poorly anticipates social movements or social change, and you used the example of feminism. But one reason I've always liked science fiction and always found it interesting is that it often anticipates or even provides a medium for sparking social change.
Such as?
Examples I can think of are with the example of feminism, John Wyndham's writings in the 60s, The Trouble with Lichen, for example. Star Trek, 1966, has a multiracial cast, puts a Russian on an American starship.
Okay, let's start with Star Trek. Do you remember the episode in which Captain Kirk is transferred into the body of a woman, and of course completely screws up because
third season.
Women can't captain a starship. Yes, there's always a few outliers, but in general, the women's movement in the late 60s was starting to gather strength. Betty Friedan's groundbreaking work was 63, 65? And it was already starting to gather work before the whole wave of feminist SF writers, Joanna Russ and James Tiptree Jr., who of course was Alice Sheldon, and all of those writers began addressing feminist issues directly in science fiction. There's a famous story about Ursula Le Guin, who I think absolutely walks on water. She wrote a story called 9 Lives, which has to do with cloning. It's a wonderful story. And she sold it to Playboy in 1969. They published a lot of science fiction, although I'm sorry they didn't like blood music. And she sold it.
They paid very well for that science fiction.
I know, I tried too. She sold them 9 Lives. And the editor, who I think might have been Hugh Hefner himself at that point, the fiction editor, called her up and said, and I'm quoting her now, asked very gently if she would mind if they published a story under UK Le Guin, because their writers simply did not understand, or the readers were not comfortable with female writers. And the interesting part is that Ursula said she agreed because, and I'm quoting her now, I didn't see in 1969 that it was important. Later on, of course, she and all the rest of us would see that it was extremely important. But the women's movement was already gearing up. And in a lot of cases, science fiction has followed what has been going on in the social movement. Yes, Lieutenant Uhura was a sort of a role model, but she's the only woman on there, and you notice she's
there's Yeoman Rand.
There's Yeoman
and there
Rand.
were Starship Captains.
Yeoman Rand is a glorified maid, and Lieutenant Uhura is a communications expert, where women have always been assumed to be good at communicating. But don't let her run a starship.
So you know the story about what happened when Nichelle Nichols met Martin Luther King.
I do. Yeah. And it was a step, but it was only a tiny step, and it followed, is my point.
But the point was that what Martin Luther King was saying to her was, you can't quit Star Trek just because they're not giving you good lines. My entire family watches that show every Saturday because it's an integrated future. It gives us hope.
It's one little tiny toehold. At the time when the larger women's movement was not doing one tiny toehold, it was ready to demolish the entire damn staircase.
It was.
Please.
Hello, my name is George Smith. I'm Southern California, loved science fiction growing up, 42 years of writing software. That's where I'm at now.
And you're 44 years old, right?
No. I wanted to, the question will be at the end of this little bit, to address the control of technology that you brought up. But I'm concerned that with the new Gilded Age we're in, and the potential of the market to buy the 1/10 of 1% of the power, and the fact that we're constantly spewing out entertainment as bread and circuses to dull the masses, how do we address, try to keep it from turning into the sheep and the shepherd?
I don't know. I wrote the whole Beggar's trilogy, there's 3 books, delineates this problem. What do you do when a large portion of the population is not economically necessary because robots or other methods have taken over what jobs they used to hold? And yes, the usual answer is, well, you have to tool up skills, you have to learn new skills, you have to ramp up to a higher level. Not everybody can do that for socioeconomic reasons or intellectual reasons or whatever. There are going to be a lot of people who don't have a place in the future unless we do something. And I don't know what it is we should do.
Crowdsourcing. You get a lot of people to attack a single problem, and you just put together the compilation of everything they're suggesting and put a shepherd over it and watch what happens. The fact is, if we cut back now from, say, 7 billion human beings to 200,000 human beings, that's severe brain damage. We have on this planet right now the greatest potential for unused human ability, not intellect, I'm not talking just intellect, unused human ability imaginable. We haven't developed the social structures and the political structures necessary to take advantage of this. Why? Because we still think in medieval terms, not just on male-female principles, but on the basic notion between what makes a person smart and what makes a person rich. Now, the rich got to be smarter than people who aren't rich. I've heard rich people say that. Why can't I have a baby? Because I'm rich. Isn't that a qualifier evolutionary-wise? No. Look at royalty. But as we get into this, we get through all of these issues. There is so much unused potential here. It's like having a mind.
We can't tap that potential until we can feed them, until we can provide clean water, until we can provide at least minimal education.
Absolutely.
And those are the kinds of things we have to address first, and we're not.
No, because right now we're going through a very tough time where the Confederate States of America have risen again. And it's not just our country that's doing this. It's a real resurgence of old line class-based conservatism that's really astonishing to watch because it's a historical resurgence.
You have the last question, sir.
Hi, I'm Joe Beer, Chief Architect at Puget Sound Energy, and been reading sci-fi, I think, since I was probably 8 years old. But a bit lighter question. So, you guys, Terry Pratchett, the late Terry Pratchett, and he mixes together social issues, technology, fantasy. Do you ever feel like you'd like to change styles a bit and maybe introduce a bit of magic or fantasy to solve problems in your stories? Or
I've done it.
New fun?
I've written ghost stories, horror stories. I've written science fiction horror stories. I've written fantasy. I've written medieval epics with a guy here in our audience. And yeah, it's great fun to switch around and do stuff.
If you're writing fiction that is trying to focus on what Hawthorne called the truth of the human heart, then fantasy works just as well as science fiction.
Absolutely.
If you're trying to write fiction that is looking at possible futures, that is rehearsals for possible futures, then fantasy doesn't quite make the cut, because we're not going to have fairy suddenly emerge in order to affect the way our societies are going. I'm not putting fantasy down. I'm a fantasy fan. I'm hooked on Game of Thrones. I was extremely upset last Sunday night at the way that it went. And I wish George would write faster. So no, I think fantasy has a place in exploring the things that fiction explores in terms of the truth of the human heart. But I don't think it's as useful for looking at the future, especially the near future, as science fiction is.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Well, when I wrote my fantasy novels, I kind of borrowed some ideas from Poul Anderson, who did both fantasy and science fiction, both extremely well. The Broken Sword, he took Elvish genetics and culture and psychology, fairy culture basically, and ran with it. And I said, this is cool. What more can we do with this? So I have fairy culture come back to Earth and have severe problems interacting with human beings. Now we have urban fantasy, which takes this as a given. But it's always been there with things like vampires and supernatural beings and so on. And I think that if you take a look at a novel like Dracula, it is very much a sociological document. Not only written by an Irishman, but it's about an upper class guy who likes to suck the blood out of all the poor people around him. And it was only until the 1970s that suddenly we started romanticizing it. Poor Frank Langella becomes the romantic Dracula. And then the women realize, oh, we can save him from that. And at that point, feminism goes right out the window. Dracula was pretty powerful social commentary.
Ladies and gentlemen, Greg Bear, Nancy Kress.
Thank
Pleasure. Thank you very much. That's myself, Seth. That was great.
Wonderful job moderating.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful talk. And as we change gears a little bit, Small rehearsal for the future ourselves. I do want to also let you know that our last program of the year is our demo competition, which will be held June 11th in Seattle at the Union Square Boardroom. And it's where we gather 6 competitors of different companies and watch their innovative pitch. And we will have judges there and audience participation, etc. So please feel free to come down and take a look at that event. Our next speaker tonight is Professor Paul Yager, Professor of Bioengineering at the University of Washington. He holds degrees from Princeton and University of Oregon, and his field of research is in microfluidics technologies that creates portable, rugged, and cheap devices for use in blood tests. When he's not masquerading as a professor during the day, which he seems to do very well, he satisfies his entrepreneurial urges by implementing these solutions that he's created in the developing worlds and really putting to practice what he's creating inside the labs. So, Paul?
So I worry about point-of-care diagnostics, and I feel like after all that huge scope we just dealt with for the last half hour, I feel like I'm shrinking it down to a tiny thing. Hopefully there's some issues. So I got to say, I grew up in the future, like a lot of you guys. I grew up in a public library around the corner from my house in New York City. There was a science fiction section where I very early on started plowing through every book they had and eventually started begging for money. But I will say, and I'll bring it back again, at age 12, Star Trek happened for me, okay? And Star Trek, you have to just think about what it was like. I grew up in New York City where you'd go and you'd look at billboards, some of them by wonderful scientists, showing how big the blast zone was going to be and who was going to die when the bombs dropped and how big our bombs were and how big the Russians' bombs were. It was a scary time. The idea that there was a future was not at all certain, okay? It really wasn't clear. The fiction at that time was saturated in the theme that we're going to wipe ourselves out completely off the map. And then along comes this show, we're not only going to make it, but it's be pretty cool, and all those social things are going to be solved. And that was a real breath of fresh air for a lot of us. And you can't have that happen to you at age 12 and not be interested in it. It also had things like green slave girls, and as a 12-year-old, who wouldn't pay attention to those? It also had this guy, okay? And while he wasn't necessarily my favorite character in the show at the time, there he is with that tricorder, and it's become this obsession that what I'm supposedly doing is making a tricorder. So let me look at that in terms of a tricorder, okay, and what we're talking about here. That medical tricorder was interesting. I would argue that if you look at the sick bay, and this is, for those of you who don't get it, I hope most of you, this is the sick bay on the Enterprise, we kind of did that. What we did over the last 50 years is we basically built out that Star Trek sick bay in our modern hospitals. And we've got everything up to and including robots and diagnostic things, fantastic tools. And I would say thank you bioengineers, which I am these days, because they made all that stuff. And at enormous expense, I might add, but it's really, really good if you happen to be in the hospital. It's a great place to be. It isn't, however, decentralized, it's very centralized. And part of what I've been trying to deal with is what can we do to decentralize some of that medical technology? So you may recognize this. If you don't, that is the Star Trek communicator. What happened that we didn't really get, I think, the science fiction people or anybody looking, was that this would happen, okay? And you look how close those things are, guys. That isn't an accident. The answer is people sat and they said, damn it, I want to have that thing just like Captain Kirk. And now we all do, or at least something even better than that. The idea that the computation that would be involved was even conceivable was not possible. You look at the really good science fiction stories, and as computers got better and better and they got intelligent, they became the size of stars in 1950s and 60s science fiction. The idea they could actually be small and move around is a radically different idea. And I argue that medicine really needs to catch up and figure this out. It's happening with all of us doing stuff, but it hasn't quite clicked yet, and that's the sort of space I'm working in. Plus the internet that moves the data any place. It's a whole new way of dealing with things, including medical data, that we're still trying to figure out how to deal with. So for me, what I'd like to do is have decentralized disease diagnosis be something that we can do wherever you are. And I focus mostly on infectious disease, but there are other things it could deal with. So the phone talks to your medical records, which talks to the doctors, talks to the ER, and it's all part of an ecosystem that allows you to stay healthy wherever you are. And thanks to the cell phones being, quote, free, meaning I don't have to build that technology, we can piggyback on top of that with things that might be cheap and disposable. So To treat a disease, you really have to know what's causing it. So if you're thinking infectious disease, well, you might have symptoms, spots, cough, temperature. Those are shared by a lot of diseases. You might also want to know about the patient history. If you had the flu 2 weeks ago and you're still coughing, it might be a superinfection on top of that. You can learn things from the history, and plus the environment. A problem, particularly in the developing world, is if you look at what happens to people who get sick with a high fever or maybe a bad headache in the tropics, they say, well, malaria is endemic, let's treat you for malaria, without actually figuring out whether it was one of 6 or 7 other things, and they give you the wrong meds. So it's a problem here, it's elsewhere. How do you actually diagnose the real cause? Well, one thing is you look at how the body responds to the disease. Antibodies, things that are generated by the body in response to that infection, and they're very, very good. They're just kind of hard to detect because it's hard to measure them in many ways. Alternatively, we go for parts of the pathogen itself, which is really the best way to do it. You go either from the proteins on it, or even better yet these days, the DNA and RNA of the bacteria or viruses. And that's really good because it's exquisitely sensitive to pick up DNA and RNA. So what we do in our lab is we're trying to identify the pathogens, bacteria, viruses, protozoa, et cetera, singly or in panels of maybe up to a dozen, not thousands, not hundreds, but dozens at this point, based on the technology we're working on. We want it fast enough that you could do it quickly at home before you had to hop in your car and drive somebody to the hospital. Anytime, anywhere, which means could be in a hospital, but it could be in a physician's office laboratory, at the pharmacy where you can get the drugs right away, at home, or as my friends like to say, under a tree in the developing world, the Gates Foundation's level 0. By anyone, meaning simple enough that we could all do it without having to read a 6-page manual. And ideally, that process would lead to, through the internet, access to the best both diagnostic and therapeutic advice via the internet, and bring that out of the laboratory and, shall we say, out of the sick bay to wherever you are. So we've sort of had a rule of how simple this has to be, and this is what we call the user experience. One of my grad students, Sam, so you have a pouch. You tear open the pouch and there's something inside, typically big enough that you could handle it, but not so big that you wouldn't be afraid to have a few in your medicine cabinet. Grab, in this case, a swab, and let's say you're trying to swab your nose. In this case, no noses were harmed in the making of this particular movie. We do a little thing which we call the 1 Hertz twirl, where you actually dip this into a liquid that sits inside the device, which then you close the box, and then you walk away. Okay, stuff happens inside the box. You don't have to do anything. You can go read the newspaper, take a walk. Things happen inside the box, and what's happening inside the box is the stuff that would happen in a big laboratory, but without the big lab, without a power cord. Then, when you're done, what we'd like to do, because those cell phones are free, is use them to pick up the information, maybe in a way that you can't even interpret at all, and then that image that you take with your cell phone turns into data you can send any place on the planet. So that's something all of us know how to do. It's a selfie of your health data. Should be fairly comfortable for most of the current generation. And that's all the user experience would be. At that point, that's when the healthcare providers may get involved. So we're starting inside the box with a very simple technology. It's lateral flow paper technologies. Those of you who've ever had or used a pregnancy test kit know what these things are like. They can be very simple. And they are simple. They're good. They're inexpensive. But they're not very sensitive. They're a little complex for certain types of things, and they're dumb in the sense they don't do very many things. So we came up with the idea a few years back, what we call 2-dimensional paper networks. And think of it as a way of programming in paper. That if you have something where you have, let's say, this has just got food dye on those pads, and can we bring the lights down just a hair? Wait a minute, I think I can do it myself. Hold on. I'm doing something. Are the lights actually getting dimmer? It says lights. Yes, good, all right. That was half a second. Oh no, it doesn't say that they're off there, but there's a lag, obviously. Okay, so what's going to happen, the wick lowers the water level, increases the humidity. Watch here, and imagine you have, let's say, antibodies or some other detection stuff happening there. So we dunk this thing into water, and the water moves up. It dissolves the food dye, which could be reagents stored dry, and then they move one at a time over that detection zone. We've programmed in a physical process out of paper. It is dirt cheap to do this, okay? And we put chemistries into it, but it's a very, very simple way of thinking about how you could do all the complicated pipetting steps or robot steps that we do in labs today without any of that, and put it in a box and make it cheap enough to give to anybody. This is an actual, one of our projects, a $6 million project from NIH, is actually an influenza test. to make a more sensitive one. What you're seeing is a device that we've designed to make very sensitive immunoassays. Simple. This is a single spot. It's sort of early phase, but it does everything we want, and it's done entirely with bits of paper, a little bit of plastic, and a sponge or two. And the sponge is a great story, but it's another movie. We're working on that project very closely with David Baker because we're not just engineering the paper stuff, we're actually engineering the molecules. And David Baker, and I know there was someone here from Institute for Protein Design, fantastic group of people designing molecules from the ground up. This is an example of proteins being designed by David Baker's group, not only to bind to the influenza virus coat proteins, but actually we glue some of them down on paper and we use it as a way to grab whole viruses or parts of the virus to actually make the measurements. It's exquisitely sensitive and relatively fast, and we can do it in something that you could dispose of easily at home and cost a few bucks. The harder project we're working on is actually with DARPA, and DARPA only does things that are, as they say, DARPA hard, and then we have to do them DARPA fast. So what about nucleic acids? Where in theory, you can not only do this, it's similar because you're grabbing part of the pathogen, but because you're talking about DNA or RNA, in theory and in practice, you can look at one single copy, which means it's as sensitive as you can possibly get. So our challenge was to take a standard lab technique and squeeze it into a box about this big. You get a little bit of complexity, but it's not too bad. So inside, we're using swab transfer again, like you saw. Then we have to break open the cells, whether they're bacteria or viruses. Then we amplify, and then we use a method called isothermal amplification. It's one of several that allows you to make lots and lots of copies from 1, 2, 10, or a few hundred going in. When you're done, you've got about 10 to the 12 copies, which is so many that it's actually easy to use the same lateral flow thing you do in the pregnancy test and get a result. So this is a run we did back in July. We sort of set a deadline and said, okay, we got to make it work. So there's someone about to bring in the swab with the 1 Hertz twirl. At a couple of seconds, Lisa is going to close the box. And when she's done twirling, and then the timer will run through the time course of the whole test. It's fortunately sped up a lot, so you don't have to sit here for the 50 minutes it takes. But what's happening is we're lysing, and we use an internal heater that actually cooks the sample and makes sure we release the DNA. Then we run the lysed sample into an amplification zone, which cooks it at 50 degrees C for about 30 minutes. In this case, we can probably do it in 15, but that's a whole other story. And when it's done, another valve opens, releases the fluid into lateral flow strips, and if you look right at those 2 little lines up by the QR code, you'll actually see lines developing in the next couple of seconds. A couple of little red lines. Then we go bring out our phone and take a photograph with the phone. And that phone, which is actually conveniently in a cardboard box the size of the device, gives a sampled result in 50 minutes. We ended up doing just 2 strips. We could do probably 6 or 8 of them at the most. So we could run a panel of about 12 assays at once on the device. I'll skip that. It's gotten more sensitive. This was done about 2 weeks ago. We got down to the point, if you look over here, you'll see it's 10 to the 2. So we're down to about 100 copy sensitivity for the device, split 2 ways, so it's 50 copies per channel. That is within an order of magnitude or 2 of the theoretical sensitivity, so we're pretty happy with it. It's pretty exciting. This is only DNA. RNA is about a month behind, so hopefully next month I'll show you equally good results on RNA viruses. Next, we want to do everything we can do with samples, so it could be nasal swabs, buccal swabs, vaginal swabs for HIV, whole other story, or an environmental swab to see if there's norovirus on the deck of your ship. We're interested in blood samples, so we want to start to move to blood samples, and finally urine samples, because that's a great place to look for things like STDs, like gonorrhea and chlamydia. And we have 2 versions of this. One of them is the all-electrical version that I showed you, which actually is the one we ran, which uses 2 AA batteries and an Arduino to run it. The other one, being worked on with us in PATH, uses the meals ready-to-eat heater, and the whole thing uses no electricity, no wires whatsoever. And when it's done, you could put it in the fire and burn it to ash, which, if you're thinking about medical waste disposal, is a really, really good thing. What can you do with it? Well, there's a lot of things beyond diseases in humans. There's a lot of agricultural uses for this if the cost is low enough. A lot of people are very interested. I will say, on the ag side, one of the people that approached us at one point was Monsanto, and you could imagine what they wanted to do with it. And we sort of went, no, that's the evil side. We're not talking to them. But like I said, there's lots of ethics you can get into. But, hospitals crossing borders. You could even think about the next pandemic, because one of the things, if you looked at what happened in the Ebola epidemic, was they couldn't get the diagnostic stuff to where the people were. And there were times where people took 6 days and they died on the way to finding out whether they had Ebola or not. That's nuts in the 21st century. We got to fix that. And this kind of technology could bring this right to where the thing is, airdrop in a load of 1,000 and you're ready to go to do diagnosis wherever it is. And you don't need a bunch of technicians in MOP 4 gear. So yes, we can do this. No, it's not the medical tricorder, okay? It's not because it doesn't have that cute thing that you wave over and does MRI, okay? It doesn't measure blood pressure. It doesn't do all the cute things you can see on the screen of the medical tricorder. On the other hand, the medical tricorder works without touching the patient. We love that. It senses all medical relevant things for parameters of humans and aliens, the ones we haven't met yet. It's got a permanent instrument, so there's no trash, which I guess is good. It comes in a handy carrying case, which is always good. Only McCoy, on the other hand, knows how to use it. We don't know how to use that thing, and he's not telling. And it only works in the Star Trek universe. So if you look at the BADNAT, which is the nucleic acid one, again, it does require removing samples from people. Swab up your nose, pee in a cup, something like that. So far, it only detects pathogens, or that you can imagine for DNA sequence, you could be typing tumors, you could look for birth defects, you could look for a wide range of things with it. It's disposable. It's a lot smaller than the actual devices. In fact, it's exactly this big. So if you want to see it at some point later, I'll be happy to show you one of the actual widgets, and this is a functional version. Simple enough for all of us to use, and might soon be commercially available in this universe. Fingers crossed. So my closing argument is perhaps this inequality is true. My hope is this could actually be something we can bank on in the near future, and by using the free thing on the left, and I still think of it as free, plus some relatively inexpensive portable technology, we can do better than even bones. I want to say thanks to my group. They're the guys that do all the work. It's an incredible group of people, and they contributed to everything you saw over there, money from NSF and IAD and DARPA. And finally, I make lots of fun pictures, and that's how I get my group going in the same direction. Live long and prosper.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Rick Rashid, co-founder or founder of Microsoft Research and the CTO of the Application Services Division here at Microsoft. Apparently, as we met last night, he mentioned that he speaks so frequently. This is the third introduction that you're getting this week of different talks. So formally, he was introduced this week at the University of Rochester, where he received an honorary doctorate from the institute that granted him his first doctorate in the first place. I'm sure this time he didn't actually have to write a thesis for it. But he's also been inducted into the National Academy of Engineering, the Academy of Arts and Sciences, has won IEEE awards, the Emmanuel Peoria Awards, and along a host of other different awards. So, Rick, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Jimmy.
How long can I take? Well, we have to be out of the room by 8:30.
Okay, thanks. I was just getting time check. So I just want to point out my bona fides here. You notice we're both wearing Microsoft shirts? Red shirts. Microsoft red shirts. Actually, this was back in the mid-1990s, I actually did an event at the Maidenbower. I did a skit on stage with James Doohan, who, for those of you who know, used to actually live in this area. He had a place up on Union Hill and frequented the QFC, in Redmond, and so you could have seen him walking around. It was a really fun thing. Although I kind of treated it like my high school play. I memorized the whole script that they handed me a week beforehand. He was a professional actor. He knew there was going to be a teleprompter, so he just read off the teleprompter. All right, so I was emoting, but he was just reading. So it was fine. He was great. I really loved the time I spent with him there. I'm also half of a character in one of Greg's books that got mentioned, so I'll just throw that up there. This is the title I kind of wanted to use. I like this title, but then I did some searching. I realized that Steve Jobs had used this title, or at least something very close to it, back in 1983. Boy, the things you find on the internet, how would you ever find that? So I thought that was kind of cool. I wanted to do something he'd already done. It's always charming, to kind of look at the way people thought the future might be. These obviously science fiction. You probably, wish that Mars was kind of like that, and certainly the International Space Station would be kind of nice that way. But in fact, all we've got are these little trundle marks where the rover went through, and the International Space Station doesn't look nearly so cool, nor do the vehicles that actually go up to it when they actually make it the whole way. Paul was just talking a little bit about things like the Star Trek communicator. Obviously, Arthur C. Clarke, envisioned the communication satellite fairly early. In Star Trek, you'd often see them, with these things called data crystals. People say, well, we don't really have data crystals, but we actually do, right? I mean, here's the memory stick. We're storing our data on crystals. It doesn't look quite so cool, but it's blue. So that, there's got to be something to be said for that. Of course, scientists are always right, when they're trying to predict the future. Obviously, Edison kind of had a vested interest in direct current, so this might not have been so much of a prediction as a hope. Albert Einstein, I found this quote. I don't know if it's really real or not, but it would seem to indicate that either he wasn't really sure that this was going to happen, or that he knew it was going to happen and he didn't want to be arrested by the FBI or the predecessor agency. Of course, there are all sorts of things you can predict. I mean, here's Arthur C. Clarke talking about real estate trends of the future. This idea that maybe whole communities would be moving to have a change of scenery. And it kind of actually happens, right? I mean, you have all these sunbirds that go down to Arizona or Southern California, and it's pretty much like a wave, if you go down on the highways there. So this probably was a vendor thing because they're all the same, but I just tried to convey that attitude. Even obviously in the computer field, it's been hard to predict, the kinds of changes that would go on. This is a fairly interesting and dour quote from John von Neumann that didn't thankfully turn out to be the case. I found this one from Popular Mechanics, and I don't know how I would be able to carry a 1.5-ton cell phone around, but it'd be an interesting idea to try out. Of course, this is another famous quote. So let me give you some real examples. This was actually a slide. This particular slide was actually created by Nathan Myhrvold, who's a guy that hired me into Microsoft. And I used this in a talk in 1993. And it really envisioned what we called a wallet PC, a device that you could carry around with you. And you pretty much could recognize most of the characteristics of what would a cell phone would be like today. This actually led to a project at Microsoft that became it was WinPad, and then it became the early Windows CE efforts, eventually led to what became Windows Phone. Now, the problem is, knowing that something like this was going to happen didn't necessarily mean you were the one that won the race to get there, right? I mean, you knew it was happening, you built various pieces, but there are lots of things that caused things to become popular or not popular that are not necessarily within your control. Here's another example of a system that I built in 1994, and actually we deployed it in a suburb of Japan in 1996. It's a full fiber optic to the curb interactive TV system. Actually had more features than the kinds of things you might even see today, but didn't take off. We eventually closed down that effort, and it was many years before the community kind of went back to build those kinds of systems. Now, why is it that it sometimes seems so hard, to predict what's going to happen with technology? Even when you're right, you're not necessarily right at the right time. And the problem is, one, technology really doesn't move in a straight line. All sorts of things happen that make something more or less possible or more or less desirable. You look at something like the smartphone. One of the key pieces of technology that made the iPhone work was the capacitive display, right? That changed the way you interacted with it and suddenly changed the whole mechanism you worked with. But also, the power Apple had created out of the iPod gave them an ability to create the App Store, which everybody knew you needed to have, but the cell phone companies wouldn't let you have it. So Microsoft, we couldn't create one for our device. Apple could get away with it because they had that power. The thing I showed you with the interactive TV, one of the reasons why interactive TV didn't take off in the mid-1990s was because of the telecom regulation that was put in place in 1996, largely at the behest of the cable industry and some of the other players, right? Which made it not economically important to those companies to move rapidly in that space, right? And it was 10 years before things really sort of happened again. And again, it was really a policy decision to change the rate at which that technology entered. I mean, in the case of Edison, of course, it was the invention of the step-up, step-down transformer that really changed the way you distribute it. Now, often technology, you create it for one purpose and it has another one. Now, this is a commercial that was created in the 1990s by a graphics company, and it kind of embodies it, and it's fun, so I thought I'd put it up here. Besides, I have the rights to use it, so,
Here we are using technology to save the planet. Our tiny chip, it does 100 billion operations per second. That is power most awesome. And we are using it to make a difference. Imagine clean air, pure water, and a new future. I wish my family back home could see me now. And we are most proud knowing that we are doing our part to help save the planet.
Attention, everybody. We're going to forget that environment stuff and use a chip for computer games. Back to work.
3DFX PC accelerators. So powerful, it's kind of ridiculous.
Blast his freaking head off!
I love it when he looks down at the plant. That's my favorite part of the whole thing. Of course, this company has since gone out of business, so they can't take the rights for me to use this away, but they did send me a letter saying I could use it. So, in my own life, I think I went too far here. I've also had this experience of creating something that then took on a life of its own. This is from when I was at the University of Rochester, where I was just back this last weekend. Of course, the Xerox Alto was created in 1973. By 1976, we had Xerox Altos at the University of Rochester. Actually, we got the first ones in 1975. This is a picture of me actually programming on an Alto. I think I still have that sweater jacket somewhere, but I'm not sure it has all the same threads it has in it there. But the work that I was doing back then on what was then really the world's first personal computer, real personal computer, led in a fairly straight intellectual line to the creation of the mock operating system, which I began work on at Carnegie Mellon University in 1983. Now, the mock operating system has had an enormous impact. In fact, it just recently was informed it just won the ACM Software System Award for this year, so which is the highest software award that they give. So it turned out to have much more of an impact, perhaps even than I expected it to. It became the basis for Mac OS X and for iOS. It influenced. It was actually a predecessor project within Microsoft. They used some of this work, and it influenced the original creation of the project that led to Windows NT. It was Digital Unix, OSF1, and Compact True 64 Unix. I mean, they used exactly the code that we sent them. I don't know if they changed it very much. Obviously, it was the basis for Next Step. Now, when I was doing this work in 1983, if you had walked up to me and said, "Hey, Rick, do you realize that the code that you're writing right now will someday be running in hundreds of millions of cell phones?" I would have looked at you and said, "What's a cell phone?" In some sense, the devices that has been used, that technology has been used in the most, didn't even exist except there were prototypes of cell phones back then, but they weren't in heavy commercial use. Now, there were specific features of that operating system that led to it being able to be used in that way. One was that because, and this goes back to a lot of the work that I was doing at that time, we wanted the system to be broadly deployed. We created mechanisms for it to support legacy operating systems. And for us, everybody else's operating system was a legacy operating system. We had great dreams for ourselves. So in particular, we even did support the Mac OS. So we implemented a version of Mac OS running on top of the Mac operating system. So it was something that was out there, as when Steve Jobs and Avi Tveinu, my graduate student, went back to Apple, they knew that technology was available and able to be used. But it also supported a very flexible way of interacting with the computer's hardware. And that meant that it could be adapted to lots of different kinds of devices, which again allowed it to be used on even what was relatively less powerful devices like the cell phones on the early iPhone. I'm just throwing this in here because I just wanted to put this in here. This is a game I did, one of the very first network computer games, also on the Xerox Alto, something called Alto Track. When I first came to Microsoft, the article in the New York Times that said I was coming to Microsoft, talked a little bit about my operating system's work, but then it also mentioned that I did one of these early computer games. What was interesting is then in April of 2000, Microsoft released a game that I did based on that original Alto Trek game. It had actual code from that original game in it, although that wasn't really the majority of the code that was left. So this became Microsoft's first online-only game. And I'll just point out, it got really good reviews. Okay. And amusingly enough, we open sourced this game about 3 years after it was out commercially. And it's still being played. I still meet people all around the world that play this game on the internet. And you go out at freeallegiance.org and it's still out there. So again, kind of unintended. I never really, it would never have occurred to me that this game I was doing on this Alto, back in those days, was going to have a life, even to this day. Now, I started Microsoft Research here in 1991, and it grew to about 850 PhD researchers. And when you build a basic research organization, you want to have an impact on products. And Microsoft Research has had a tremendous impact on pretty much every product that Microsoft has produced. And that's great. But the more interesting thing for me is always the sense of, it's not so much about the fact that, you come up with ideas that create products, is that you're also creating, in some sense, sort of a treasure chest of ideas and technologies and people that can allow you as a company or as a country or as a world or entity to survive when something happens, or when there's something going on in the world, whether it's a new technology, a new competitor, a new business climate, you can adapt. And I'm going to give you an example. This is a chart of computer memory storage and pricing. And so it gives you a sense of the decline in the costs associated with memories over the years. But hidden in this chart is a several $100 million dilemma for Microsoft. So in 1992, we created a piece of technology that we were very proud of that allowed us to dramatically reduce the working set size of 32-bit programs. All right, so by working set size, just the amount of memory at runtime that the program needed. It was a lot of math. It was basically just a math problem, but you're very proud of that result. We went to the product teams at Microsoft and we said, hey, we've got this great thing. We can make your programs take up a lot less space. It's going to be great. And there were great meetings. There's very smart people in the product teams here. They interacted with us. But at the end of every meeting, it basically was the same story. They'd look me in the eye and they say, you guys are just smart. All those symbols that you put on the blackboard, you guys are just smart. But we don't have that problem. Okay. First off, it's 1992. We don't have 32-bit code. We have 16-bit code. So this really isn't going to help us very much. And we know we're going to have 32-bit code because we're starting to work on that, for our next releases. But by then, we're going to have lots of memory. So it isn't going to be a problem, right? So basically it was like, you guys go back to work. You're smart. I'm sure you'll figure out something that's of use to us and get back to us, right? But the interesting thing is what happened is that this plateau right here, from 1992 to 1995, when coincidentally Windows 95 was supposed to be coming out, the memory prices really didn't change. I mean, there were some trade issues between the US and Asia, all sorts of other funny things going on. So what happened is we're getting into close to 1995. Microsoft then had 32-bit versions of Office, 32-bit versions of Windows, but surprisingly, they took up twice as much space because it's 32-bit code instead of 16, right? And this was a problem because memories hadn't changed. So you had corporate PCs with 4 and 8 megabytes of memory, and that was not a mistake. I said megabytes. That's what we had back then. I know now it seems like everything's a gigabyte or a terabyte or a zettabyte. But back then it was megabytes. And so we couldn't really run our software on those machines, our 32-bit software, and have decent performance. So this was this terrible problem because we're getting into the ship cycle for Windows 95 and Office 95, and what do we do? Well, luckily we had that technology. We'd actually been refining it. We made it available to the product teams. We worked closely with them to put that technology into place. And we got back that factor of 2 that we'd lost, right? Because that's what the technology was capable of doing at that point. So one idea, basically, a bunch of mathematics, allowed Microsoft to ship Windows 95 and Office 95 when we otherwise wouldn't have been able to do so and have decent performance. By itself, that was worth several $100 million to Microsoft when that was a lot of money. Back then you could, take your family out to a movie with a few $100 million. I mean, they didn't have 3D movies back then, but you get the idea, right? I mean, you'd stoop down, you pick it up if you saw it on the ground, okay? Now, especially in Silicon Valley, I'm not sure, all the startups, they wouldn't even bother with a few $100 million. But the point here is that there was the product groups were actually right when we talked to them originally, right? They were right that they didn't have that problem. But then they did, right? And because we had that sort of treasure trove of technology and people who knew how to use it, it meant that we could basically allow them to ship when they otherwise couldn't. Even more to the point, Lotus and WordPerfect, they didn't have that technology. They couldn't ship, right, their 32-bit products until quite a bit later. And when they did, they were fat and slow compared to ours, right? And you could ask Ray Ozzie. I mean, he knew we had something. I mean, we've had this conversation, actually. He knew we had something. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he knew it was killing them. He knew it. And so this is really, this looks like a very boring slide. Lots of money here. Not to mention, positioning within the industry, all based on an idea coming out of the research group. I'm going to run through a few things that have come up, within research and give you kind of a sense of where do some of the ideas come from and how do they turn into products. So back in around, I want to say 1996 or so, Jim Gray came to me, and he's one of the foremost database people in the world. He came to me and said that he really believed we could put a terabyte database on the internet and make it available. Right? He didn't even know exactly what kind of terabyte database he wanted to put on. We talked about it a bit, and he settled on the idea of saying, well, what if I could get a whole bunch of images of the Earth, right, and put them in a database and make them available for anyone to get access to? So that led to the original Terra server, and for the first time we had images, ironically, from we had them from the U.S. Geological Service, but we actually had a huge number of images from the Russian Space Agency. I mean, Jim and his associate actually went to Moscow to negotiate getting these images from the Russian Space Agency, which they gave us because they were hoping that people would see the images and want to buy them. All right, so that's where it came from. Now, that led in turn to things like Virtual Earth. Obviously, Google came out. They bought Keyhole, and that they introduced their own product during that period of time. It led to what became Bing Maps. But it also led to something which is, in a way, in my mind, even a little bit cooler, especially for this audience, which is the original Sky server. And Jim's idea was, well, if we could get all the images of the Earth, why not the images of the sky? right? Why not get all the great data from the great telescopes and make that available 24/7, not just to astronomers, for whom it would be super useful, but also for everyone, for anyone, for kids, for students, for amateur astronomers. And so that became the Sky Server, and we worked with the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. We worked with a number of major telescopes to put that together. And that became a resource for the community. It wasn't, yes, we made this available to people, and it became very, very exciting to them, but it became a resource for the astronomy community. That also led in turn to what has become a much more popular product, which is the Worldwide Telescope. And you can go out there today and use the Worldwide Telescope. We work with NASA to not only get images from all the great telescopes, but also images from the satellites around some of the planets that they have, so those can be integrated into the database as well. So let's see if I can make this work. We'll hope so. I just wanted to show you just a real quick snippet. This was from a TEDx talk that I gave to give you a sense of what you can get out of this kind of data.
Visualization. So this is a visualization of the visible universe. There's 1 million galaxies in this image that represent all of the galaxies that have been recorded by the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. Each point there is about 100 billion to 200 billion stars, right? We're not just a speck here. We're not even a speck in a speck, okay? We're a speck in a speck in a speck. And I can show you this sort of, you're basically, it's as though you were standing outside the universe looking in, and that's what you're seeing. So this is the kind of thing, again, this is using data not just from the Sloan Digital Sky Server, but also from the galaxyzoo.org, which is a crowdsourcing site. Now there's the Milky Way, which by the way isn't really a spiral galaxy, it's a bar spiral galaxy, and the Spitzer Infrared Telescope has been able to verify that. And in fact, the central bar is more peanut shaped than anything else. Now we're going into our solar system. And what's interesting here is, you're going to see, that's Mars, by the way, the little red outline. As we pull away, what you're going to see is those two blotches of yellow. Okay, those are the asteroids that are actually clustered at the Lagrange points of Jupiter in the solar system. And by the way, in this representation, every object about the size of a school bus or greater is represented.
The magic
so it gives
school
you
bus.
a sense of what's possible and what's visible. Now, a new feature that we're just bringing online and will be available later this year allows you to import data from Okay,
I'm going to stop it there, but just wanted to give you a sense. I mean, you can go out and do this yourself. If you want to see what the world, what the universe looks like from the outside, go to the Worldwide Telescope, wwt.org. You can get this on your own. And it's pretty exciting stuff. Let me see if I can go back to my... It's a little hard to do from a distance here. Okay. Now, we were talking earlier about, artificial intelligence is destroying the universe and our robot overlords and so forth, or our robot ping pong buddies, which is sort of what we have here. The real question is we have had in the computer science community a question for a long time of, how do we get computers to actually be able to program themselves, right? So it isn't just a question of we write code for them. How do we let them write code for themselves in some fashion? And a few years ago, we actually began making a tremendous breakthrough in this area. And the first instance of it, the first use of this technology is in Excel. It's in Excel in 2013. It's in a feature called Flash Fill. And what this feature does is it allows you, let's say I've got some columns of data, and then I want to create a column where I'm now taking data from other columns and maybe rearranging it, doing something to it, manipulating it. Well, all I have to do with flash fill is put in 1 or 2 examples, and then it will figure out the rest. So I'm going to show you a little video clip here to give you a sense of what that looks like. So here, you're just typing in a little bit, and poof, it figures out the rest of it. I'm looking for last name, and what it's doing is it's effectively writing a program that's extracting that information from the data in the other column. Now, here's another example. This is a little bit more complicated, where it basically is trying to pick out the first letters of the words to create the acronym. And what's interesting here is that the way this is really working is that what the computer is doing is it's taking the inputs that it sees and the outputs that you give it. It is then creating every program that has those inputs and that output, and then it is optimizing to say, well, what is the optimal program that would do that? The simplest, easiest program that would do that from all of those programs. And it turns out that almost always that's exactly the right answer. It isn't always. Sometimes it will make a mistake. You then correct the one example of the mistake. It now takes that as a new input, and it does that again. So effectively, it's sort of programmed by example, but in this case, it's write a program that fits the examples. And you can apply this in a lot of different ways. And in fact, in Office 2016, which is just coming out, and in a number of our new Azure products, this technology is being expanded upon. But it is the first instance I'm aware of actual automatic programming. Maybe not for our robot overlords, but nevertheless, it can satisfy that problem. And I'll talk about another thing. Amusingly enough, we were talking about my PhD at the University of Rochester earlier. My PhD was not in operating systems. It was actually in computer vision. And I did one of the earliest PhDs in the area of what this is called moving light displays. Basically, it's extracting 3D structure from moving images. And so it was one of the seminal works in that area. At Microsoft, over the years, we developed a lot of different technologies looking at ways in which we could build systems that would do real-time 3D computer vision. That obviously then, at the time we didn't have a specific purpose for that, but ultimately that led to things like the Kinect, which sold 10 million units in its first year, and other technologies. And in fact, more recently, the same kinds of technologies that were developed that led to Kinect have also come down to create what's now the HoloLens that will be coming out. And here's sort of a visualization of what it looks like to have a HoloLens on. So this is really driving this notion of being able to do real-time 3D computer graphics that you can superimpose on the world and see. So again, basic research technology, in this case, my work went back 40 years, being translated over time into the products that you see companies like Microsoft doing. The last thing I'm really going to talk about, sorry.
In Chinese.
I'm going to back up for just a second. In around, I want to say 2008, 2009, I put out a challenge to my research organization. In some sense, you could view it as a selfish challenge. I said, I want to be, I give speeches in China to thousands of Chinese students every year. I want to be able to go out on stage, give my speech in English, have it be translated into Chinese in real time. Okay, so you guys go work. Get back to me. I believe the technologies were getting to the point where that was not irrational. But I'll tell you, some of our researchers thought I was just nuts. I remember having lunch with the speech research team a couple of days after I sent that memo out, and one of the young researchers, he was just beating me up. He was saying, "You just don't understand. We've been working on this problem for 25 years. This is all the progress we've made. We haven't been able to really crack this nut. It's probably going to be another 25 years, and this isn't going to happen." I know you're like our corporate vice president and everything, but, don't hold your breath, man. So it's always bad when the young people are telling the old people that. So
to actually speak to you in Chinese.
Here I am in China in 2012.
Now the key thing here
And
from
I
many
think I need
Chinese
to-
speakers
Yeah, there we
can
go.
produce a text-to-speech system that takes Chinese text and converts it into Chinese language.
So you can see the
And then we've taken an hour or
speech
so
recognition part here. You can see
and
the
we've
translation
used that to
part happening over
modulate
there.
the standard text-to-speech system so that it would sound like me. So what you see now is the result of that change. I'm speaking in English, and hopefully you'll hear me speak in Chinese in my own voice.
Yes. I'm waiting for it to start.
Again, the results are not perfect. There are in fact quite a few errors.
结果并不完美。他们集体反复犯错误。
There's much work to be done in this area.
在这方面有很多工作要做。
But this technology is very promising.
用这个技术很有希望。
And we hope in a few years that we'll be able to break down the language barriers between people.
数年后，我们希望能够打破人们之间的语言障碍。
Personally, I believe this is going to lead to a better world.
这我个人认为，这将导致更好的世界。
I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations today.
希望今天你喜欢其他的讲座。
Thank you.
谢谢。
So, you know, this was the first time a
To actually speak to you.
got to move on here. It takes I will say, just offhand, takes a little bit of guts to stand on stage for a speech demo. All right, especially when the room is echoing, when you've got 4,000 students in an auditorium, and you're kind of hoping it's all going to work out okay. We had, of course, practice, but that doesn't mean that I was completely certain what was going to happen. But it was a tremendous experience. Literally, there were students in the audience crying because they'd never expected to see something like this happen, and it was really moving, I think, to be part of that and to be part of that environment. Now, what was interesting, and I mentioned before, the young researcher that was explaining to me that this was never going to work. Well, this is the reason why it worked. For the longest time, the word error rates on the major tests in speech recognition had not budged. I mean, that no one had made any progress, for something like 10 or 11 years in this space, right? So that's why this particular individual was very, very pessimistic. What happened, though, is that starting around 2009 and then accelerating to the point where I actually did my presentation, we made a tremendous breakthrough in speech recognition using what's called deep neural networks. So it was a complete sea change in the way the underlying technology worked. It changed the way the whole curve of the problem, and it took the word error rates to a point that's not that different than human. Human error rates would be right around here, about 3%. This was sitting right around 6 or 7%. So it gives you a sense of how much of a change happened. And then this has led to being able to actually turn this into a product. right? So we now have, you can go out, it just was recently opened up to anyone. Use Skype Translator. Currently, I think the languages are Spanish, Mandarin, and I think Italian. They're more going to be coming online. You can talk to someone in real time in another language. It will translate what you're saying into a voice on the other side. And in fact, I've even heard examples of people using this in communicating with the deaf, right? Because of course it also puts up a transcript of what you're saying. The error rates, I mean, it's not obviously a perfect system, but the error rates are actually very, very, very good. And since we're running a little short on time, I'm not going to show you a video of that, but you can go online and see that. Now, you can go even farther. So one of the cool things is that as we discovered that deep neural networks could be used for speech recognition and create a tremendous improvement in the error rates, we also began experimenting with using it, and the whole community did as well, in using it for all sorts of other AI problems. Here's a particularly cool example where we built a cell phone app, that could recognize pretty much any breed of dog from its picture, right? So it knows that that's a Pembroke Corgi. I don't even know what a Pembroke Corgi looks like, right? It knows it's a Shetland sheepdog. It actually is better at picking out dog breeds than humans are. So that's pretty cool. We've even taken it farther, and this is some work that has recently come out. We can now sort of decompose scenes and recognize what's happening in a scene. So this is an automatically generated description of that picture, right? And we've shown that for a number of image recognition tasks, you can now do better with the computer than a human will do. That's an amazing statement. We didn't think that was going to happen for many, many years. And it's beginning to happen, not on all tasks, but on certain very specific tasks. So again, these are all examples of, basic research, pushing the boundaries in a particular area, in some cases being pushed by the researchers, sometimes unreasonably, to see what could happen, and having that then translate into a significant result and change. And I think some of the technologies like the automatic programming work, the deep neural networks, are going to have a huge impact on what we think computers are capable of doing over the next 5 to 10 years. And I'll leave you with one thought here, this was earlier in the discussion. I mean, fundamentally, I don't think scientists are any better than science fiction writers in figuring out societal trends. We basically just provide the raw material that society uses to create whatever it wants or needs for its purposes and to solve its problems. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for coming to this event tonight. Please spend a couple more minutes to ask questions to the panelists and speakers, and we'll see you next year. Take care.